In 1946, a group of Mussolini's allies, most of whom had been members of the Italian Social Republic, which was the final incarnation of the fascist regime, founded something called the Italian Social Movement, or the MSI. Now, this was in the fringes of Italian politics for a good 40 years after the war ended. But in 1995, the MSI merged with more mainstream right-wing parties to become what was called the National Alliance, or the AN. The AN publicly distanced itself from its fascist history. AN was later absorbed into Silvio Berlusconi's center-right Freedom of People party. This was in 2009. But in 2012, because of differences within this party, a breakaway group formed mainly of former AN leaders. They left Berlusconi's party to found what was called the Brothers of Italy. The leader of that party, ironically, was a woman named Giorgia Meloni. The victory now of the far-right and Eurosceptic leader Giorgia Meloni, the leader of the Brothers of Italy, has sent shockwaves through Europe and beyond. It has brought about a significant rightward shift in Italy. But more than that, it raises serious questions about the Europe integration project, which began 30 years ago with a common currency, the euro, and a common European market. Giorgia Meloni's election also marks a decisive rightward shift post what we have recently seen both in France as well as in Sweden. European leaders are watching Meloni's coalition and its comfortable victory in the Italian elections in shock and in horror. Italy, remember, is one of the founding members of the European Union. It is also the third largest economy in Europe. Meloni will lead the first ever far-right nationalist government in Italy since Mussolini. She also becomes the first ever woman prime minister of that country. On Crux Decode, so how justified are these views of shock and horror? Should the European Union and Brussels learn to respect sovereign election mandates much more? Will Meloni be forced to temper her views while she runs a three-party coalition? And how may all of this impact the ongoing war in Ukraine? So far, Italy has been a staunch opponent of Putin's aggression. The economic impact of COVID and now, of course, the war in Ukraine, with high national debt, rocketing inflation, all of this has deeply damaged centrist parties all across Europe. Far-right parties have not only pushed centrist parties to the right, but they've also become normalized. Far-right parties are no longer ostracized. In fact, the direction of political momentum in Europe is changing. Europe had a wave of centrism both before and during the pandemic. But now it feels like the political table is tilting back in the direction of populists, particularly populists on the right. Under the outgoing technocratic Prime Minister Mario Draghi, Italy played an important role both on economic issues as well as, of course, in its response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But now, Italy has turned away from the European mainstream, and Italy that is led by Giorgia Meloni is likely to change course, both as far as spending big is concerned and also in its response to the war in Ukraine. If Meloni chooses to side with other populist and Eurosceptic leaders inside the European, the likes of Viktor Orban of Hungary or Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki of Poland, she can then certainly be a pain in the neck for Brussels. Consensus within the European Union's decision-making could become almost a nightmarish experience. For Meloni to team up with Orban and company is the nightmare that Brussels has always been dreading. Hungary is an outlier. It is a pain, but it is still an outlier. But Italy is not an outlier, and particularly if it's going to join forces with Hungary and Poland, then that could be a serious challenge to mainstream Europe. The first European congratulations, in fact, to Meloni came from Hungary. Orban's political director, Balázs Orban, congratulated Meloni in a Twitter message which reads something like this: "In these difficult times, we need more than ever friends who share a common vision and a common approach to European challenges." Now, to be fair to her, Meloni has said that she supports NATO, she supports Ukraine, she has no great warmth for Vladimir Putin of Russia, but her junior coalition partners, Matteo Salvini of the Lega Party and Silvio Berlusconi, who's been multiple times former prime minister, both of them are clear Putin fanboys. Berlusconi, in fact, has said that Putin was pushed by the Russian population, by his party and by his ministers to invent this special military operation. The plan, according to Berlusconi, was for Russian troops to enter and in a week replace Zelensky's government with a government of decent people. Italian popular opinion is traditionally sympathetic towards Moscow. In fact, about a third of the seats in the new parliament have gone to parties who have a rather ambiguous stance on Russia. As this war proceeds and all the domestic economic costs start piling up, Giorgia Meloni may take a slightly more lenient view of this war than Mario Draghi did. Earlier this summer, in France, we saw Marine Le Pen's party, the National Rally, win over 40% of the votes for the very first time in a parliamentary election. Supporters of the far-right Swedish Democrats celebrated earlier this month after they became the country's second largest party. Things had looked so different even about a year ago in mainland Europe. Even the victory of Olaf Scholz in Germany, a man who is slightly center-left, that was ensured by the collapse of center-right Christian Democrats who had their worst showing in history. But then again, Germany has always been an exception in Europe. When the populist five-star movement led Italy from 2018 to early 2021, it created major fights inside Brussels, whether it was on immigration or on asylum. Meloni is expected to concentrate on topics like immigration, identity issues, and future European Union rules covering debt and fiscal discipline. But analysts think that she might pick her fights carefully. Remember, Italy's got a huge mountain of debt. Italy's debt is 150% of its GDP. Remember, Brussels has promised Rome tens of billions of dollars as part of its COVID recovery fund. For this year alone, that amount is 19 billion euros. That is 1% of Italy's GDP. Mario Draghi had already implemented some tough reforms to satisfy Brussels, so there's really no reason for Meloni to come in and mess it all up and thereby agitate the markets. For the future, though, there are worries that she will push for an expansionist budget, looser fiscal rules, and thereby make the more frugal countries of Europe far less willing to compromise. But the bigger loss would be the centrist axis, which Mario Draghi, the former Italian Prime Minister, and the French President Emmanuel Macron were trying to create after the loss of influence and interest by Germany. Italy will go from a country that provided some kind of a political center for Europe to one that Europe is going to watch rather anxiously. There was a sign of that anxiety just before the election when Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, warned that Brussels had the tools to deal with Italy if things went in a difficult direction. Now, this was seen as a hint that the European Commission could actually cut funds to Italy. But there was a total political backlash to that comment, particularly from Meloni's allies. They even saw this as an open threat. Von der Leyen was asked to respect the free, democratic, and sovereign mandate of the Italian people. The Italian coalition partners of Meloni call this institutional bullying. But analysts are also saying that Meloni must be given a chance. The very least, she should be judged by her actions as Prime Minister and not by her speeches as a campaigner. You campaign in poetry, but you govern in prose. Now, if she's made to feel rejected, that of course would push her to a corner, and in that corner she will find the likes of Orban and the Polish Prime Minister, soulmates who are waiting for her, and she'll team up with them. But if she's greeted as a legitimate leader of Europe, democratically elected, it will be possible for the EU to do business with her. Also, European leaders know two things about Italian prime ministers. First, they're not particularly powerful at home because of the coalition compulsions. And two, they tend to last not very long. In fact, since World War II, the average tenure of every Italian prime minister has been just about 18 months. Yet, despite international worry over her ascent to power, a strong Meloni may be better than a weak one. She's now shedding her former image of being a populist. She's instead presenting herself as something like a traditional conservative. In fact, her policy preferences would fit broadly with both EU as well as NATO principles. So it's not Meloni who poses the biggest risk to Italy's stability. It's actually her likely coalition allies. One is, of course, the Lega Party, the Russia-friendly Lega Party, and its disruptive leader, Matteo Salvini. Salvini will at some point through the course of this coalition want to challenge Meloni's leadership. And he can only do that by clawing back the populist vote. Not the centrist one, but the one that is there on the two flanks. So his strategy would be to outflank Meloni on both the extremes. In fact, his party has proposed a flat tax which will replace the existing progressive income tax code. He's also talked about a pension reform that would give every Italian access to a full pension after 41 years of employment. Now, estimates suggest that if these plans were to fructify, this pension plan alone would cost another 50 billion euros. That's about 3.5% of Italy's GDP. Now, such plans for heavy borrowing is going to spark off another budget showdown with Brussels. Meloni knows that the long-term viability of her government will depend entirely on whether the markets accept her leadership. So therefore, she's making an effort to appear as mainstream as possible. A good showing by Meloni would at least offer some stability and allow her to take more responsibility to govern Italy from the middle. By softening her populist stance, Meloni has shown that she understands what's at stake for her and for her government. Over the long term, Italians will have to judge her far-right agenda and her plans to transform Italian democracy. But in the short term, both for Italy and for the European Union, and perhaps most importantly for the ongoing war in Ukraine, a strong Meloni would be better than a weak one.